institutions require democratic deliberation, where a group of people get together and make decisions around a table. This system does not. Its express purpose is the abolition of all forms of democracy and to move everything into the realm of market transactions. So you have a million fucking options of politics to choose from, and you can buy anyone you want, but you're never going to sit around a table with people and deliberate and make a democratic decision together. That is the anarcho-capitalist design. So the left response being like, wow, we've got so many more places to post our editorial opinions. Like, yeah, I am a little bit, antagonistic about that, because it's clearly not working.
Let's say you're an anarcho-primitivist, right? You want to go and leave society behind, go and live in the woods. Well, you're going to need to find the 10 other people in your part of the world who also want to do that. Or let's say you're a fascist. You're also going to need to find your fellow travelers online. Whatever your political ideology, you need to convince people of it. And that means you need to use Instagram or YouTube, or maybe even have a merch store. And so the logistics networks that sustain both your local variety of peculiar esoteric leftism, whatever that is, and the far right are the same. Run by the same people, by the same companies, who profit from your beliefs, whatever they happen to be. Perhaps the seeming ideological freedom of liberalism is just window dressing for a process that continues regardless. But even in the supposed free marketplace of ideas, that's where you are right now, one ideology is clearly winning. It's the ideology of the networks themselves, of the infrastructure, of the logistics that brings you that political diversity, techno-libertarianism. And so maybe it's time to get real, to get sober, to tune out all the ideological noise and focus on the one thing that seems to truly matter: our confrontation as workers with capital. My guest today is artist Joshua Citarella, host of the Doomscroll podcast and founder of the community Do Not Research. Although, of course, you should go and do your own research. He cut his teeth trying to understand the ideologies of the present, the synthetic nonsense of a terminally online world. But since then, he's sharpened his analysis. And maybe he thinks now it's time to lock in. This is the final episode of Series 1 of Do Your Own Research. Please suggest in the comments who you think we should get on for Series 2, any general improvements we can make to the show, and I will see you back here in a few weeks for Series 2. This episode connects to my conversations with Trevor Paglin on the psyops that control what we can and cannot even see, and of course to the episode with Quinn Slobodian and Ben Tarnoff on the Musk universe. The map, as ever, is freely available online on the Novara Media website. The link for that is in the show notes. Josh Citarella, welcome to Do Your Own Research.
Thank you for having me. Good to see you again.
We last spoke on camera 2024. I think it was just after Donald Trump had been elected. He was president-elect. We came to New York after having been in Pittsburgh for election night. You took us up to your Manhattan penthouse, and I think it was you, me, John Podesta, and the commandant of Antifa, who decided to become the liberal Joe Rogan, right? I think that's who it was.
Wow.
I recall the quartet.
That,
yeah. And I just wanted to check in, like, how's it gone being the liberal Joe Rogan, like 18-month mark, big milestone. How's it going?
18 months of doing the show. We're at almost, I think, the 2-year mark of having started filming, because we started shooting. I think we did the first episode with Young Chomsky right around this time last year. So it really has been nonstop. It's been a kind of exciting, unpredictable ride. I guess I was optimistic or hopeful that we would have ended up here, but it was kind of difficult to envision all of the twists and turns along that path. I guess I have been to some degree disillusioned by solutions that I thought were maybe relatively easier for how to solve certain crises of media strategy and tactics and things like this, and certain political solves that I had been maybe more optimistic about, let's say 6 years ago, 8 years ago, maybe, when I started publishing. And I also think that the media environment has significantly changed within that time. The streaming, the clipper economy from streamers has really significantly shifted the landscape of like where attention is moving. So yeah, the kind of podcast dynamic, or I guess the way that we're used to talking about these things, even from just a few years ago, a lot of that terrain has really, really shifted. So yeah, we may need a Democratic Confederalist Adam Friedman, something like this. I'm not sure what the solve is right now.
And so what are the market forces underlying that shift? So you're talking about the move away from the kind of the long form podcast, very sad for me, of course, somewhat sad for you as well, and into much more chopped up kind of little bits of content that get presented in a scrolling format to people and are not presented organically in the sort of the language of online media, but presented because there is a certain kind of market incentive. This is something that we've seen for sure on the right in the UK. Lots of people, lots of kind of famed influencers. I don't know if this story touched you, but there was a story of a Sri Lankan AI slop engineer, basically, who ran a kind of media empire, mostly on Facebook, which was pumping out this kind of racist bile, largely against people who, in lots of cases, look like him, right? Against Indians or Sri Lankans or Pakistanis and so on in the UK. And yet it was immensely profitable for him. So how do you understand the market dynamics of that kind of shift? And is there just sort of a pure cynicism behind it?
Yeah, I hadn't heard that story in particular, but there's a whole bunch of stories like it. So it's very believable. I think that the thing, the primary dynamic, maybe it helps to back up a little bit of like the theoretical approach that we might have brought to this maybe 4 years ago, 6 years ago, something like that, is that there were basically pockets of cognitive dissidence within big sections of these online audiences, whether that's left or right or some kind of loony banana combination of a dozen different things. And previously, what that kind of represented was, because there's this heterogeneity within the audiences, you can kind of locate those pockets of dissidence where people hold two contradictory beliefs, and that would be an opportunity to either clarify or radicalize or spur some type of change. And what has happened with just, very generally the kind of short formatization of content is that there's not enough sustained attention right now to actually kind of clarify any of these contradictory beliefs. And so I just feel like we're seeing more and more factions, more and more individuals that are holding like a dozen different contradictory views of the world. So it's become kind of a more difficult terrain because, I think there was this kind of flaming circus hoop, at which point all three hoops would magically line up and you could kind of fire the arrow directly through and make this, impossible feat of actually aligning all of the different messaging that you needed and reaching these different audiences and seizing those opportunities, as small and narrow as they were. And I'm just seeing a lot of that stuff has kind of disappeared in the last few years. So yeah, I'm wondering if I gave a talk at the European Parliament, this is maybe 2 or 3 months ago now, and I was kind of summarizing a lot of the work of the last few years, stuff that you and I came up with, things that we would theorize in private chats and discords and things like that, going back to like 2018, and a lot of that work, it was rigorous, it was scholarly, like the citations are from studies at Cambridge and Harvard and things like this, at think tanks at Cornell University and so on. And so basically the time in which it took to produce the expertise to solve the problem for the old media system, the old media ecosystem, now the terrain has totally shifted and we have a whole new slew of problems. And it's like, oh, fuck, this is like another game. Yeah, it's like they had a patch update or several patch updates. So I guess I'm just feeling a little bit less certain, whereas before I had, I think, a pretty concise, expedient, constant North Star about how you can really fix or at least take advantage of certain opportunities in the media landscape. And some of those things now I think have just profoundly shifted to the extent where there may not be an opportunity there, and it might just be time to pull the plug on the whole thing, or some much more radical form of regulation where I think we have to kind of take a step back and ask much bigger questions rather than just working at this content layer, so to speak.
I wanted to trace that through in your work because I think that you and I first spoke in our lives. Obviously, past lives, different matter. I'm sure we had many other connections, but in this life, we spoke first, I think, in around 2018, around the publication of your Politigram piece, which is a kind of a long form essay presented in a book format, 10,000 words or so. And in that work, as people have probably seen, because it got a write-up in The Guardian and blah, 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 you look at the splintering of ideological structure. So people, we used to have sort of the classic kind of quadrant of politics. That itself is a kind of psyop that maybe we can talk through how we arrived at that one. But we used to have that kind of quadrant, authoritarian, libertarian axes, left-right axis. And then as the people kind of came online, as often teenagers started to come into the world, right, they were picking from the grab bag of human history, the grab bag of ideological thought, and that was producing these incredible, strange, confected new ideologies, Islamo-Jewish feminism or something. Like I'm just kind of like I'm saying some nonsense. Like
yeah, that sounds right.
It's always there's always a kind of a one-upmanship, right, where you can kind of create like a more absurd, kind of social democratic ISIS or something like this. Anyway, nice. And so there's thank you very much. I'm sure you can do much better than I can. But there's and that was kind of phase one, I see, of your work. And then you had this insight that I want to just get people to tell people, because it's such a brilliant insight, which is that you took, and this is when you were sort of working more often as an artist, you took the ingredients of Goop, Gwyneth Paltrow, super femme-coded, unleash your inner goddess like products, and InfoWars, incredibly masculine coded, paranoid, end of the world is coming, the globalists are taking over. And you pointed out these two things have the same ingredients, right? They're the same product. How has that line of your thought developed? Like, how have you moved from the position of thinking about ideology as the kind of space contestation through to imagining that as just what you described as a moment ago, the content layer on which kind of obscures and lays over this logistical infrastructure that actually supports ideology?
Yeah. There's I was doing a kind of overview of some of the last few years of my work, and I noticed a kind of constant theme of just like, there's a lot of options going on. There's a lot of like different flavors of things where, you look at a Josh artwork and it's like there's 12 different flavors of political ideologies or genres or different things. And so that kind of became a recurrent theme throughout the projects, where I would try to establish a frame of like, what are all of the things that this contains? How do we hold them up for comparison? And what are the similarities that we can see through these dozen different flavors of anarcho-monarchism, of Islamic anarcho-primitivist caliphatism, queer anarcho-transhumanism, et cetera, and forever. I've got a libertarian neo-monarchism flag in the corner over there. So what actually, if these things are so incredibly disparate, different opposite ends of the political spectrum, how do they all cohabitate in the same space, right? There must be some underlying uniformity to the thing. There must be an underlying pattern that connects all of these seemingly disparate elements, and trying to find what is that kind of ideological or technical frame or philosophical frame that unites those things. So in the case of the ideologies, as they were called, like email, kind of internet, insane hyphenated ideologies. This to me was kind of a clear downstream of the long tail of internet culture, where it was about creating all of these infinitely granular niche consumer identities, where you have like, beach wave and hauntology core and all of these kind of different genres. You have a prefix and you have a suffix, and it's a new musical aesthetic and it's a new Tumblr aesthetic. And the origin of this goes back all the way to C-punk from, basically the first year where all of young people got online in like 2011 or 12. So that felt rather clear.
House? Was that was
Witch House?
What was
perfect
Witch House?
Example. Yeah.
Was that a real thing?
Witch House was great. I still listen to Salem. Like, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, some of them were just really good. It was a very exciting period of internet culture. And I think that's how I was first able to recognize, probably if you take 2011 to 2018 when I published the book, there's kind of like a 5-year window at which the kind of jamming together of internet culture, kind of, A-B combinations, prefix, suffix, that stuff moves from musical genres into political ideologies. And if you can recognize, different content, but the same kind of formal strategies, that's what's being produced on the other side. In the case of InfoWars and Goop, however, I have to give credit. There's a fantastic article by Nikhil Sanand in 2017, I believe. And these things had been kind of like, there were rumblings about it before, but this was the first piece of journalism that actually put the individual products of things that were sold in the Goop store, either their own kind of white labeled brand or products that they carried, and things that were sold similarly on the InfoWars store of products that they carried or white labeled or so on. And they have, shockingly, it's not just like one or two common ingredients, but they have the identical active ingredients in both of those products for like over a dozen. It's like 10 to 20. It's kind of it's a long list. It's a long list, to the extent where I could create this photography series and I could fill like, 8 shelves full of stuff that would just be all of the same, active ingredients shown next to each other. But so how do you then connect, what I think are culturally on the opposite sides of the political spectrum, where you have this like doomsday prepper dad, a divorced dad who's angry at the world and is kind of plotting for the end of the collapse in his bunker, versus your Goop mom who's doing Lululemon yoga practices and sunning her perineum and whatever else. There's a weird kind of crossover between these groups, and so that the politics of being anti-establishment in some way, but also, I think most importantly, distrustful of institutions, people seeking medical advice, financial advice, optimizing their plans for the apocalypse, all of those sorts of things. You see like a kind of, a similar kind of institutional distrust and a kind of hyper-individualism that we ourselves are kind of responsible for our own fate, and kind of by implication the fate of the world, because all of these like climate scenarios are kind of built into that worldview. So yeah, there is a for me, as a materialist, is like the fucking least unpopular politics in the world now, but the right politics. What those groups actually do is evidenced by the identical active ingredients. So if you were to take this kind of materialist analysis, the Goop divorced dad and the Lululemon yoga mom who's buying from Goop are practically kind of doing the same thing. They have, I can really go off on this for a long while, but like it gets down to the level of like their preferred form of self-sufficient energies and cultivating their own crops, and why they want to have solar panels instead of nuclear power, because they want to be, basically untethered from the rest of society and entirely self-sufficient. Like the worldview actually goes really, really deep. And if you look not just on the literal active ingredients for like, Ayurvedic herbs and things like this, there's all sorts of other kind of philosophical overlap between those two groups. But yeah, that's that's been a kind of recurrent theme, and it really does help to I think get under people's presuppositions in some cases.
I guess there's a kind of a terminus of that thought that you've pushed even further now with a piece in the Vienna Biennale, also designed with New Models, Carly Buster, and Lil Internet.
The best.
Indeed, yeah. I get very confused because on my podcast app it says NM for Novara Media, which is this show, and then also new NM for New Models. And I think there's something going on with this, like those two letters, that it's uniquely powerful in the content space. Anyway, New Models, and you have designed this thing, which is, describe to me what we are looking at here on the screen. What is going on here? Why are we in a merch shop / anarchist kind of like, we're in the museum merch shop of the weirdest museum in history. Like, what's going on here?
Yeah, so all of this was Carly's idea. I had nothing to do with this. I was just there to help out mostly, and she said she wanted to take responsibility for everything that was included in this photograph. So I'm happy to let her. We're looking at an image that's this is an install shot from an exhibition I did with New Models, Caroline Busta and Lil Internet of the New Models podcast. It's called The Online Marketplace of Ideas. This is around 400 some odd pieces of internet culture, which we have gathered together into a physical exhibition in Venice, Italy. That's at Palazzo Diedo. I believe the exhibition is still up until the end of October or early November. I think early November. So as people are seeing this episode, if you're in Europe, it's still up. There may be some items left. I think a lot of it is getting shoplifted actually in the last few weeks.
Oh, you can buy it.
However, there will be a website to buy the stuff, but it's for all practical purposes, it is a physical exhibition, not a functioning store. We're going to make an online website to sell the things afterwards. But the concept for this exhibition was looking at some of the things that we had mentioned earlier. Post 2024, the so-called podcast election, there's this strange convergence between media entities and political movements, and it's not especially clear how these things are aligning and the kind of period of transformation that we're going through. So practically speaking, we wanted to create a kind of vibe and experience and aesthetic of like, well, what does this period of culture and crazy politics look like? It's something that's hard to kind of wrap a visual around because we don't have a lot to like physically hold onto. It's the feeling of scrolling your phone. And so our solution was to, all right, what is the material footprint of all of the different media entities and channels and different weird projects and political parties that are very active or notable in this space? Well, they all happen to produce merch. So we recreated the experience or the feeling of scrolling by creating this like enormous catalog of all of these different merch pieces from internet culture. So you'll find, just to mention a few of these, like you can see like the Alex Jones book in the front. There's the MAGA Doctrine from Charlie Kirk. There's an A16Z shirt in the back. There's a Boogaloo Boys shirt. There's Pod Save America. There's any and every podcast you can think of, you will find some tiny Easter egg from them built into this space. So yeah, we're trying to represent a lot, and I guess in the theme of what we talked about earlier, this is maybe the widest possible spread of all of these options where if it exists in the kind of combative, chaotic internet attention economy space, we wanted to have it represented in some form here.
There's a sense in which this is it's not exactly cynical. I think that's the wrong way to describe it, but it's a kind of a distancing move where we say, okay, this is just sort of content layer. And because it's just content layer, there are other things perhaps we should pay attention to that are sort of beneath that or construct it. Before I get your response to that, I just want to point out there are two bits of content here that are not merely content. There is the piece of Novara merch, Anti-National Socialist Club up here. And then there is a book here called The Rise of Ecofascism, which I wrote and which is definitely not content. But everything else, sure.
We've got a pair of Novara Media socks in there as well, actually. But I think they're in the back row.
And if you try and resell it, you will hear from our lawyer. Do we have a lawyer? I don't know. I've got to ask the producer if we have a lawyer. But if we have a lawyer, you'll be hearing from them. Anyway, so this is a kind of, in some ways, a cynical gesture or a way of saying these things are, the variety of ideologies doesn't matter, right? Mm-hmm. Do you think we are over-indexed on ideological difference? Or am I just completely misreading this artwork, this installation, and that there is not simply this kind of, feeling that this layer, the content layer, could be anything, doesn't really matter what it is. What's important are the kind of logistical relationships or the kind of the systems underneath it, or is that just not what you're aiming for?
Broadly, the idea is like, do I think that there is a meaningful difference between these very different podcasts, or is all content just like agnostic and it does what it does in the
in a sense,
media
like
ecosystem?
there's a kind of, Right, because the platforms have become to dominate this. You are watching this podcast almost certainly on YouTube. Maybe there'll be a clip on Instagram, right? Like, because there is that sense that the platform becomes to predominate, or the platform organizes how things appear to you, that it doesn't really matter what the content is. The content can be anything. Because I feel like that's going too far. How do you understand the kind of tension there?
Well, so I think that this is part of the problem. This is also part of why we haven't been able to correct what's going wrong with politics and media. So, I do think there is, of course, obviously a meaningful difference between like Joe Rogan and Pod Save America, or Alex Jones and Novara Media, and whatever. Sorry to drag you guys into this too, but that's kind of asking the wrong question. So. What I'm trying to evidence by putting all of these different options together, meaning the ideologies flags, or the InfoWars and Goop, or the enormous cross-section of these different media entities, is that there must be something that actually unifies them, which we have not yet been able to see. And if we gather all of the constituent elements, we can visualize the pattern. We can see what's going on. So primarily, our way of approaching this question has been that these media entities attempt to exert influence onto the world and politics, meaning whether people choose to vote a certain way, or organize in their workplace, or protest, or donate to candidates, or whatever. We are influencing them through the editorial content that we publish. We say that this person is good, you should support them. This person is bad, you should not. And I think that is just too narrow of a scope, because not many of these things did not exist, let's say like 10 years ago. So my way of understanding this is that we had a handful of libertarians in Silicon Valley design an entirely new media environment and then launch it to great success. And that in and of itself had a kind of plan underneath, which was to disintermediate all political actors from institutions and create this enormous like Cambrian explosion of ideas, an online marketplace of ideas, literally the name of the exhibition. And so what they wanted to kind of create through this was the extremities, the broadening of the Overton window, the opening of the gates, so to speak. So that was not just a philosophical choice, it was a technical choice, because they gave an individual connection to all of the different users who could upload. So, a lot of these people are just individual streamers or individual podcasters, the kind of stuff that you could do from your, like, what we used to call bedroom pop back in the when all the waves and chords and everything were for musical genres, that it was the type of music that you could make in your bedroom. You could do it on a laptop. And now we have that for politics. So my way of kind of looking at this is that the design that has went in through this, basically through the entire stack, the kind of philosophical design of like, we should basically have free individuals to espouse editorial opinions without institutional gatekeepers, to two, the technical or the kind of software design for all these platforms, which is like, conceivably, you could have designed enrollment in platforms as political parties where you had like a requisite 150 people or 1,000 people or 100,000 people that kind of sign up and, publish as a magazine or something like that, a kind of threshold that needed to be met to have access to these publishing tools. Instead, we gave it to every single individual, right? We in the kind of philosophical software design of these platforms, we gave it to you, Richard, and to me, Josh, rather than to us as a bundled together magazine. So as you start to like trace these things down, the technical level and the legal level, there's a kind of interesting story. I'm going to botch some of the details for this, but Quinn Slobodian, historian, wrote a fantastic book called Globalists about the origins of neoliberalism, was telling me that for a lot of these different merch pipelines, there are, there's e-commerce stores that link to some physical warehouse in the world, and those things kind of move in the most, or wherever there's the least friction and the least kind of like tariffs and legal legislation to kind of slow these things down and incur extra costs, so you're not having standing inventory and all this kind of stuff. So the most kind of seamless global logistical infrastructure, and a lot of the legislation for Prospera in Honduras was also supported by the Gildan t-shirt company, who, if you think of like what company in the world is moving the most very cheap amount of commodities across as many borders as possible, it's probably t-shirts, actually. So there is this very strange connection between all of these things, which is not just a kind of philosophical question, but also a software question, and then a material and a legal question. And so if we start to look at it from that level of like what was kind of technically instantiated through these platform designs and so on, all of a sudden your and my individual editorial content seems far less impactful than the grand design of basically unfettering and opening up the gates for every institution. So, I mean, sorry, I'm throwing a lot at you here, but like the enormous amount of like far right material that would have been gatekept from the National Review in the 60s. And there were instances of the 60s of groups that were further to the right that were kind of gatekept from neoconservatism. And you basically kind of have those similar dynamics in all political parties where, you know, we're doing a, you know, social democratic thing to get certain vouchers on our healthcare covered by the state. And there's some like ultra left party that's actually like, well, we don't want to have social democracy. We want to burn down the state, and those people would be gatekept from the party newsletter or something like that. So there's always this kind of like gatekeeping element to holding together institutions and pruning things that are antagonistic to those ultimate goals. And the design was to not do that. That was expressed in the design of our platforms today.
So not do the gatekeeping.
Yeah, it's to unfetter all of the gates and to basically erode all the institutions, atomize all the institutions into individuals that would be like tiny little boats on a seastead that would voluntarily collect into these new formations.
So there is an extreme ideology there, right? And it is the ideology of a kind of anarcho-capitalist framework, or what you talked earlier as libertarianism, which has its own sort of peculiar dynamics. On the board, we have Prospera, which we talked about in the interview with David Adler, when we talked about Honduras Gate. And I think it's an incredibly important thing, and I want to actually come back to that a bit later. But I just want to sort of, the first bit of content that I think I saw you make, apart from the written stuff, was one of these kind of iceberg memes, where you were live streaming a process of looking through these kind of deepening strange ideas. And the idea of the iceberg meme, right, is that at the very top you have the sort of conventional things, and then below the waterline it gets a little stranger, and then you go all the way down into the very depths. And I kind of constructed my own modest, I don't know if you can see this, hope you can.
Yeah, it's pretty extensive, my friend. yeah.
My own modest iceberg of some description here. But the idea,
you're gonna be scrawling this on the walls in a few weeks. Oh my god.
So, not to come back to our sort of merch opportunities here, but I think I would really love a tea towel, or maybe a bathrobe. Like I want this map on a dressing gown, I think, so that you can wander around your house and after you get out of the shower or something, and feel the kind of the pulsating insanity of the whole thing. This is in some ways an attempt to do something like that, to draw a kind of map that allows us to understand the distinct layers of the present, right? And there's a reason why I've put reactionary politics, which is one of our kind of like distinct layers that we've talked about a few times, Daniel Trilling, Hetty O'Brien. The reason why I put that at the very top and not sort of somewhere in the depths, not in the sort of the causal structure that powers the world. And the stuff that we have down here are things like the kind of the Nikification model, right? Where you institute the process on a global scale that allows you to make the millions of t-shirts that then circulate around, right? That's the kind of the process that we're talking about here, We also have, you know, the structure of cheap nature and the history of sort of imperial structures, global political structures, ideas about who the human is, and so on. And so there's a kind of a logic in some ways to the structure of the iceberg. And the reason why I'm telling you about this, right, is because in some ways this is my political strategy. This episode is the final episode of series 1 of Do Your Own Research. We'll come back in a few weeks. And so I'm kind of using that opportunity to reflect on political strategy and like why we're doing the show as we're doing it, and how we should do it better. Post comments, please, and don't be afraid that they're too weird.
Well,
what I want to get to with you is that you have a political strategy as well, right? You began with a political strategy. You wrote about it in a long blog post called The New Pipeline. What has changed? We talked about that at the beginning a bit with the clipping, but like what else has changed about that process of doing hegemony formation, or is that not even the right term?
Yeah. Well, I feel fortunate to be in conversation with you because the kind of iceberg, literal iceberg that you just brought us through, these have been, I think, really difficult conversations to have. And in the past, 2 years, I've talked to a lot of people in media, and very often I have the experience where you're kind of like talking to a fish in water and you're telling them what it's like to be wet. And they're like, what do you mean? I've never been any other way. And this media environment is not normal. It was not given to us. It is not a granted constant of nature that we just, walked into. It was made intentionally and it has a purpose. And that is, probably something closer to anarcho-capitalism, as you had mentioned, or some extreme version of libertarianism. And basically, let's say social democracy to democratic socialism or whatever, that stuff is only really tolerated because it fits within the overall design of this extreme libertarian vision. So for them to have a kind of, flourishing ecosystem of millions of different consumer options and preferences, that was the design, and some of them will be things that are opposed to the greater overall anarcho-capitalist vision, but we're kind of, we are stuck literally playing within the rules of a game that they wrote. So yeah, that is a very frustrating thing, and I feel like the hyper-focus on the impact of our editorial content that we publish of support this candidate, don't support that candidate, do this, don't do that, that those things often miss the much larger process because, basically it's vision, just to say the quiet part loud. Institutions require democratic deliberation where a group of people get together and make decisions around a table. This system does not. Its express purpose is the abolition of all forms of democracy and to move everything into the realm of market transactions. So you have a million fucking options of politics to choose from, and you can buy anyone you want, but you're never going to sit around a table with people and deliberate and make a democratic decision together. That is the anarcho-capitalist design. So the left response being wow, we've got so many more places to post our editorial opinions. I am a little bit, antagonistic about that because it's clearly not working. Okay, to get a little bit deeper down the iceberg. So I published this piece. What was this? Maybe a year ago, called A New Pipeline. And I think a lot of people will be familiar with the metaphors that we're talking about here of different funnels and pipelines and kind of moving people through these politicization pathways on social media. And a lot of that, some of the things that I had mentioned earlier was about, locating sites of cognitive dissonance where people had two contradictory beliefs, and then you could kind of push them to, you have to commit to one of these. You can't hold both because they are they're in conflict with each other. So, I've thought of that. I came to this project. I think of myself as a very open person. I listen to a lot of people who I profoundly disagree with. Center left liberals to insane far right stuff to teenagers that want to reject the Industrial Revolution. And in all those cases, you learn a little bit. You get a kernel that kind of improves your clarity and understanding of the world, even from people that you really don't personally like in some cases. But I have a kind of editorial line and a strategy and what I think the opportunities are. And so I have done my best to, pepper in those people where is possible within the grand scope of the show. And so conceivably you could have, we have covered, I think, a pretty wide spectrum of the left. And then, my particular tendency, flavor, and solutions that I think appeal to me, I think you can kind of find them, throughout the episodes of, like, we brought Catherine Liu and Vivek Chibber back for a second episode that is, much more the things that I'm aligned with. So I think there's a shifting terrain of, like, the strategy for the next few years and what we may choose to put in there. There's a lot to be figured out still. I think the next thing I want to direct people to is we did 2 programs at the Whitney Museum with David Harvey, who you've had on the show. He's one of the most fantastic writers and thinkers alive today. And Bhaskar Sankara, his new book called The Blueprint, with 2 other co-authors, Ben Burgess and Mike Beggs. So, yeah, I guess I think that some of those things we do want to have answers for, and having a cereal aisle of different flavors and political options is less helpful in some cases than just having one correct answer.
I've been watching you for a long time, and it seems like the more absurd the world gets, or the closer it gets to expressing some of these very confusing, heterogeneous ideologies, as you called them a second ago, the more sober you become. Is that something you feel as a responsibility?
I was thinking about this yesterday, where there could have been a version of this where I just kind of went in for the memes and, like, found the most absurd internet shit possible. If you can imagine, more absurd than monarcho-syndicalism and shit like that. And that would have just been, like, a fun, like, I guess I could have become J-Reg, I suppose. Like, there's a version of me where I could have become J-Reg. And he is, to be clear, one of my favorite artists. And I think he is a really, really brilliant thinker. But I have found kind of the opposite effect, where, if you were in the trenches in 2017 during the Great Meme War and the explosion of the Overton window, and, you're like a grown man and you're seeing 2 13-year-olds get, like, deep in the weeds in the fucking footnotes of Oscar Longa and Ludwig von Mises about the calculation debate. And you're like, I have a college degree. I'm a professor. I'm literally a professor. I can't answer this question. It's because the questions are actually really fucking difficult to write, and the debates around those topics determined the 20th century. So I think what I took from that was, like, rather than getting more ridiculous and memey and whatever, part of the reason why all of this chaos is happening is because the questions themselves are actually very difficult to solve. And to solve them, you have to actually engage in those somewhat annoying and scholarly debates about calculating Pareto efficiencies and whatever. Like, what is it the left really wants to do to the economy? What exactly does it want to do? And it's very easy to say, well, we want to fight the rollback of certain public programs that existed a generation ago or 2 generations ago, and we want to refund those things. It's like, okay, so if our grand designs is to get back to, like, the 1970s version of Keynesian economy, there were still revolutionaries during the Keynesian economy. Like, what is it we're actually proposing here? Why would we now, with, smaller growth rates and, a level of historical development, as the economy slows down and things get more and more complex, like, why would we think that social democracy would be better now? Like, there were reasons why it failed in the past. All of these things, they're, like, real questions. And so it has had this kind of sobering effect where I'm trying to entertain this full spectrum of absolutely absurd and ridiculous ideas, but then find things that are, the actual solution that can kind of, it's like that, it's like a very small domino that once you can actually answer the question, it just causes everything else to kind of fall in line. So I'll give you a kind of maybe one last example for this. But Quinn Slobodian has a book out called Hayek's Bastards, which came out maybe last year. And in the book, he describes an ideology called New Fusionism, which is we can kind of go through the long history of the 1960s and the Sharon Statement and what the old fusionism was. But it is basically a kind of internet ideology of sorts that is reforming conservatism now and what we're commonly calling the new right, which is kind of populist in some weird way. Populist in some weird way, but then also libertarian and racist and nationalist. And how do you square all these things that are seemingly contradictory? We are kind of cobbling together new internet hyphenated philosophies to kind of solve the contradictions of these insane belief systems that we've built up out of the inability to solve all of the contradictions at the core of our economic system. So, I see these things as basically being entangled together. And that kind of all is to say that like there is hard work at the end of it that is hard and slow and difficult for a reason. And there's not just a quick meme solution to a lot of these things.
This question of sort of return, right, is and either whether or not you return to social democracy and sort of Keynesianism, or whether or not you return to a idea of sort of heritage Americans. I was speaking the other day to James Pogue, right, who was sort of outlining how he sees J.D. Vance on the screen right now on the left, not on the right. J.D. Vance could do some very serious damage to American society if he wanted to, right? He could institute programs that would be disastrous. He could deport millions of people that would be catastrophic for those people and also for American society writ large. But there is a broader system, right? And part of the thing we're trying to do here in this show is to outline how that broader system actually works. And that's a system that constrains even the most ideologically driven US president. And so when we're thinking about sort of return in that kind of fusionist sense, I think this is kind of a fantasy. It's a fantasy that could turn into a great deal of violence. It's a fantasy that could end up killing lots of people and be disastrous, but it nevertheless remains a fantasy. And if I'm being honest, when I think about Vivek Chibber, Catherine Liu, I kind of feel the same thing, right? I kind of feel there's equally a kind of fantastical dimension. If we just get the old band back together, and the old band here is the working class, then we can do the same thing that we did in the past. What was that? I mean, I think that's with J.D. Vance, I'm less willing to be generous, but with comrades, I want to understand the kind of the process here. So how do you understand how you sort of moved towards that position of the Vivek Chibber and Catherine Liu variety, and how could you maybe just spell it out for the audience? Like, what is that position?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think the most expedient answer comes from Adolf Reed, which is, basically since the New Left period in the United States, people have been looking for some type of historical subject, like what is the first actor that makes everything else move, and in the Marxist view, that was the working class, and people have tried to propose different historical subjects, revolutionary subjects. I don't think any of them have worked. I think basically you observe over the course of the last century, there are large states that can massively transform economies and do some element of redistribution. I think that's required. And I think that the working class is the agent of change in history. And while the role of labor is diminished, it's like, as Adolf Reed says, labor as compared to what? What else are you going to put in there? Like there is nothing else. None of those other things work. And there's not even much of a reason to think that any of those other things work. So what are you practically trying to do in the short term on the political left? You're trying to rebuild the labor movement. And there's basically, sorry to say it, but there's basically nothing else to do until union density is at like 33%. Like none of the other stuff matters. It's fake. And if it's not fake, it will be 1,000% seized by the professional class. The only thing the professional class, which disproportionately dominates every single institution, every media entity, the only thing that they can't seize is the one-to-one direct confrontation with capital that is labor. So yeah, there's basically nothing else to be done, and that's how you get to like the short-term politics of like what you need to funnel or move people into or direct them towards. Now, if you want to talk about like what do you do after union density is at 33%, which is the historic high in the United States, what are the policies and what does an economy look like for the 21st century that isn't just the old school version of social democracy, right? Because we can't repeat all of those things. That's a different conversation. But we're starting to get into territory that is like now so narrow that like you and I in our particular narrow media genre that comes from, you know, a decade in the art world and then in like para-institutional spaces on certain discords and whatever. I just don't think that we're going to be able to get. I put it this way: like, do 100,000 people on a weekly basis want to listen to, Bhaskar Sankara talk about what type of voucher program we're going to have for decommodified housing in the, you know, post-capitalist society that comes from David Schweikart's After Capitalism in 1997. Like, we're talking about a very small group of people here. So if you're speaking to a large audience, I think the only thing to take from that is like you build the labor movement. Everything else comes after. And if we're on a, you know, panel discussion at a, you know, think tank, museum, or party meeting, then we have other more granular discussions about the details.
I do want to agree. So I do want to agree. And I also want to talk about where I think the people sort of are, right? Not perhaps people in those 100,000, right, which is, as you say, like a relatively small group of people, but where people are more sort of widely. And perhaps this is where you and I are approaching this problem differently, right? Because I totally see that the message to hammer home, and if I look at the sort of people who are really effective on the left in American culture over the last 15 years, the really standout two examples are Bernie Sanders and Zoran Mamdani, right? And they both had incredible message discipline, where like we have massive levels of wealth in income inequality, and things are unaffordable. This is my plan to make them affordable, right? Incredible levels of message discipline. Great, really good. In some ways, I think people are at a level of political thought where it seems to lots of people like there are endlessly new things happening in the world, right? There is a kind of endless churn of novelty and strangeness and so on. And every new event seems ripe for a totally new idea, because perhaps lots of people don't necessarily have particularly coherent ideologies. I'm not talking again about audiences. I'm talking about like people in general. People necessarily don't necessarily have those kind of coherent ideologies, and therefore, the task really is to grab people who are thinking about, oh, what's the connection between this thing and this thing and this thing and this thing that I saw on the news, right? And so the reason why we're doing this sort of the conspiracy map that you can see in front of you, right, is not because the conspiracy map is the final form of the world, but because the world is endlessly producing new kinds of entity, new kinds of things to be explained. And I don't feel like looking at this map, thinking about the things that I've been thinking about for the last, 15 years, right? I don't think that there is a single kind of structure that emerges from that allows me to say it's all fundamentally about this and not this. And that's not the position I wanted to be in. It's not the position I was at the beginning of that, where I did think it's just about organizing.
And just to be clear, this, when you say this and not this, you're talking about labor as compared to what are the alternatives, or what? Am I understanding that correctly?
I think the thing is that, okay, so maybe this is a bit in the weeds, but
let's get in the weeds.
You're talking about the need for let's do it. You're talking about the need for a historical subject, and I totally get that. Right, I am 100% behind that idea. I think it is foundational, in fact, to a leftist or progressive politics. And yet, there are just too many things, right? Why would history set itself up? This is now we're getting absolutely out of the bounds of what I want to talk about. Why would history set itself up such that there was a driving seat? And why would there be a thing that history had also made to put in that driving seat? Like, why would that happen? It's a kind of projection of the 19th century. It's a kind of it's a thing that was temporarily possible in the 20th century, and now we are in the Cambrian explosion of entities, right? Not necessarily ideologies, but of a world that is becoming increasingly complex, becoming increasingly automated, becoming increasingly organized around things that don't seem to fit into that framework. And I just worry that when we say it's fundamentally about this, we miss all that variety. And it's in that variety that people make sense of their own lives.
So, look, I would say that part of what makes this job harder now, and I mean this job, like what we do, be like doing, saying editorial opinions on the internet, more or less. Part of what makes that harder is that the system is explicitly designed to produce as many options as possible. So this is like the, sorry to be so economistic about this, but I really think that it is the answer, which is that if your vision of how to create new value in society comes from, this Austrian school of like unlocking human wants and desires and fulfilling preferences, and that, the marginal utility that you might get from, a specific flavor or option is different from the marginal utility that I might get from it. And to fully unlock all of the value in society, we have to fulfill everyone's niche, hyper, specific consumer preferences. If that is your theory of value, you produce this, and I'm gesturing towards this iceberg of a million billion different explanations for what is going on in the world. That's what this was designed to do, because that was the underlying philosophy that has then been written in law and code and software and everything else. However, if your analysis is that there is one commodity in the world that is distinct from all others, which is labor power, that you put this in on the front of the equations, and it's the only thing that produces value on the other end, that just gives you a very, very different worldview. So, and I mean, we don't really have to debate which one is correct, because we just see it being proven in real time. Like, what are the superpower economies that have this, deranged theory of value of fulfilling human wants and preferences? And like, what are their growth rates versus the societies that actually, make stuff and put labor into the equation? I really feel like a lot of these things are, it's not sexy, what people want from internet culture. Sorry, I'm cutting down to the kind of like, I think that this actually is the kind of quickest answer for most people. What they want as kind of young, radical, rebellious, or revolutionary and internet addicted people is they want to sift through all of the iceberg of the internet, and they want to find some niche theory that like is the new thing that hasn't yet been tried and actually solves everything in a new way that is kind of like a cool vibe to be a part of, and proposes something that's just like, it's all just vibes. And actually, if we like vibe this way, then we can do revolution. It's like, none of that stuff is real. None of it's real. Like, the old thing was real. It's not a single trend cycle or like a music genre that's popular for a few years. It's like, we're talking about centuries of political economic formations that, like, the way that feudalism was transformed by capitalism, like there are new things that are happening now. But like, to really, really get into what was the mechanism that allowed those things to change, or force those things to change, yeah, they're not like, it's not going to be the next cottagecore that's fucking revolution. It's not going to be some like vibey jungle music that you stumble across and now we've like, theory posted our way into having a new revolutionary theory. Like it is actually just the old stuff. And there's enormous periods. I mean, this is why it's like, this just plainly speaking does not appeal to people, because you could go through, I just asked David Harvey, what was it like to teach Marxist Capital in the 90s? And it was not cool. There's like 5 people in the class. Like there are going to be, 40-year eras where ideas are incredibly unpopular. But like if you're looking in the grand scope of like historical development and measuring these things over centuries, like things can go out of vogue for kind of a long time, for like a lifetime, and they can still be correct. They can still be right. It doesn't disprove them. There's an enormous amount of social forces and other things that suppress ideas in all sorts of different ways. But I think it actually really is that simple. And I would say that the part of what has made this whole system appealing is because people are so desperately searching for an answer, because it is so hard to rebuild labor now, because labor has been, which is essential to Marx's analysis of capitalism, labor has become incredibly, incredibly more productive than when the book was written in 1867, right? So labor is like proportionally way less valuable now, precisely because we've had all of this development in technology and automation and everything else. But that doesn't mean that it's wrong. And there's not another like lever to pull that we can do, like, find some other historical subject that's going to move us into the new stage of history. That's, what is the after capitalism or socialism or, democratic social or whatever. It only is labor. It only is the workers. So yeah, that's kind of where I am with it. And, I love all of the other stuff, but like, I think we do ourselves a disservice if we kind of leave it at that level and don't send people towards like the real stuff at the bottom of the iceberg.
I totally get that. I mean, the critique is well taken. I do understand what you're getting at. I also, as I said, like I want to agree, and I want to say that really is the fundamental contradiction. I guess what I'm saying is that I read out a quote, right, to James Pogue the other day, which was the quote from which all that is solid melts into air comes from, which is not from Capital, but from the Communist Manifesto. And at the end of that, he says, and there, because all these things have been stripped away, because the family has been dissolved, because religion has been dissolved, people are forced to confront the real antagonism that structures their life, which is the relation of labor and capital. And that is just not what happened, right? Historically speaking, right? We have a proliferating series of mediations. And Marx spends his whole period between 1948, when he writes the Communist Manifesto, and the publication of Das Kapital Volume 1, wrestling with this question of why that didn't happen, right? Or why that perhaps isn't the only historical trajectory. And there's a kind of sense that, and before Das Kapital, where he gets the answer, where there is this sort of, coherent systemization of what capitalism is, there is also the Grundrisse, right? And the Grundrisse, for people who don't know, is a basic collection of Marx's notebooks, right? It's a way of where he, and if you read them, they are notebooks, right? He's really just wrestling with this question. Okay, what does that mean for my system? What does this mean for my system? And the insane sort of hubristic way in which I'm thinking about what the map does is not as a proliferation of possible explanations, right? Because I think the explanation will come back to something quite simple. There is a reason why the exact things you're describing, cheap labor power,
hey, yeah, there it is.
Food, energy, raw materials, labor power. Right. This is the reason why this is the bottom of the iceberg, because this is the fundamental thing.
Yeah.
Right. But you really do have to go through the other things to understand. Okay, how do all the different parts work?
Right.
Because the theory was written. Das Kapital was written 170 years ago. Right. And the world really has changed in lots of different ways. There are many more things to contend with. There are many more critiques of that position than there were that are sensible critiques. Not that they're the random sort of, critiques you get from the right, but you really do have to go through the process of synthesizing the heterogeneous world into something before you can arrive at the answer. And I feel like the kind of the certainties of leftism are really like, they don't grip the world in the same way they used to, at least for me, right? And maybe that's just like because I'm searching for novelty on the internet, or maybe I'm a sort of irony poisoned or kind of conspiracy poisoned person. And maybe that's just like an individual story about my own position that Vivek Chibber would say, call a mango, right? Someone in media arts or NGO sector. And that's, maybe that's something I need to wrestle with myself. Maybe I do just need to say, it's all about the labor capital relation, It's difficult, of course, to say what it is that, the person you're speaking to should do. And it's difficult to say what you should do, right? Because those are two people you're too close to. What should Novara Media do? Like, what are the conditions of our global economy that Novara Media should be speaking to? Is it the same thing that you were just saying? Is it that kind of drilling down into the real contradiction? Or is there something else that what would you prescribe for us, right? As a kind of a strategy for gaining something like hegemony. And there is a question about whether or not hegemony is even a thing that can be gained anymore, right? What would you have us do?
Yeah, I think, well, look, there's a temptation to say that there's a one-size-fits-all solution, and that like every podcast should be like this, every talk show should be like this. And there's a kind of, when you're a hammer, everything becomes a nail. I think that the way that you have to approach these things is that there is a ecosystem of different interlocking parts. And so you have to identify which piece you are most similar to if we're going to theoretically design what would be a functional media ecosystem, and all of the different elements within that. So my sense is that Novara Media, downstream, for example, is doing exactly what it should be doing, which is reaching, in the scale of left media, very large audience, which is relaying kind of populist talking points. So sometimes it's more academic, sometimes it's more populist. Like those things are great. I would say that what you and I are in the business of is more so like we are creating the intellectual work that people in the organizations will draw upon to later find like what are the policies, organizational activities, propaganda, all of those types of things that they will then enact in the real world. So these are questions of audience size. Do 1 million people want to hear about this niche theoretical idea? Probably not. Is the niche theoretical idea very important in some case, and maybe 5-10 years from now it will be deployed and have a very powerful effect? Right? Like the evidence for this is our own projects in some cases, where like you can look back through the timestamps and you and I were saying these things 6 to 8 years ago. It's like I
Yes.
literally just a big part of the project now is just taking literal sentences and passages that I published 8 years ago and saying them to an audience that is an order of magnitude larger. So intellectual production is important. We do need to have these things. But when I would talk about this with people who are similarly in this field, it's like, well, let me pair a few different examples. There's 120,000 people in the DSA. How big is the leadership? Is the leadership like 10,000? Is it a tenth? Is it 12,000? What would a successful media program need to reach if its goal was to create the intellectual ideas that the people in the party draw upon to then determine their activities to scale to 120,000 to later affect, 120 million, or, you can kind of fan these things out like that. You would want to hit the kind of, 10% intellectual core of the leadership in the political movement. So the role of different media entities depends vastly on their scale. And there's probably, pop culture things like Tim Dillon that do an enormous amount of kind of harnessing anti-establishment sentiment. And then there's a potential pipeline where that person who, first got, pilled about Israel and Gaza by Tim Dillon and some, multi-million viewer comedy show finds their way sequentially through over the course of 5 years to this kind of very intellectual podcast, and then later gets politically involved in all those types of things. So I think we're doing exactly what we're supposed to be doing right now. The problem is more with the very popular outreach, where I think there's an enormous confusion about like what what is for the activist intellectual core and what is appealing to a majoritarian democratic audience, and bad optics. There's a lot of that. There's an enormous amount of bad optics on the left, and basically people who are not putting that kind of fan of influence in order for things that are, you know, revolutionary or necessary, but should not be exposed to a popular audience, right? Like if you're going to have a coalition for an electoral majority that's, you know, 80 million people, do you want to tell them to abolish the family? You know, like there, stuff like that. So, yeah, it depends kind of where you fall in that ecosystem. Sorry for the very long answer, but that's there's not a quick way to solve this one.
No, that's good. I mean, like that is exactly it. I think the thing is that I don't think of this as an intellectual project, right? In a sort of sense of theory. I just think I'm just trying to understand what's going on, right? Like, and I'm trying to allow there to be enough edges such that when something new happens, we can tell a coherent story. So, you know, there's some new events, right, that takes place, and there will already be a collection of context that we can draw in and try and use that to understand or to explain that. Going back to that thing about you being early to things, I wrote my first piece about Lux Maxing, I think, in 2017. And then there was the sort of the, there was the clavicular explosion at the beginning of this year. And everyone was like, new fad just dropped. And I was like, no. This is really not this is really not new.
10 years too late, yeah.
Where is the puck skating to? What are the kind of the weak signals that you're seeing in the places around you, in the cultures that you're sensitive to, that you think are going to blow up? Because we talked about earlier a little bit about Prospera, the special economic zone in Honduras, which was attempted to be repealed by the leftist government, and then they were sued for breach of contract. And then it's going to basically happen now because there was an election that was dubious, and the new right-wing president came in and is now going to expand that. They're looking to expand also into Kazakhstan. They were recently rebuffed from Malaysia. This is a project being organized by Balaji Srinivasan, who's a tech investor in the US. Like, that was a weak signal 8 years ago, 10 years ago. It's now like a new kind of country, basically. You know, this is a thing with real substance and heft in the world. What are the kinds of things that you think are like that now, which might bloom in the future?
So this is a great frame, and it's kind of like integral to the analysis that you and I would bring to this stuff over the last few years. So I want to say, and you know, I'm kind of going out on a limb here, so I haven't fully figured this out, and maybe it's a good chance for us to kind of riff on this and for you to give me some feedback in that direction. But my sense, being granularly involved in these spaces since like 2015, is that the flourishing of internet genres and ideologies and kind of political chaos online directly corresponded to the mass adoption curve of these big internet platforms in 2012, where the gates opened, the Overton window opened, and there was just a lot more. And, you know, maybe it was harder to find like anarcho-capitalism and agorism and all kind of niche strains of Georgist libertarian Hoppianism or whatever. That the territory, the ideological territory, my feeling now is that it is more or less mapped, and the degree to which new entities and new ideological strains come into the picture has significantly decreased over that 10-year period. So my sense is that the philosophical territory was already largely mapped, that the internet played the kind of combination game with different signifiers, where someone could be a trans ISIS or whatever they're fucking making up on Twitter. That we went through that kind of the Flusser media theory combination game of A/B pairing. We did all of that long tail combination. And so the questions that we're seeing now are not just how does the design of the internet reorganize and create permutations of culture, but we're watching transformations that are just political economy and they don't have their genesis in an internet movement right now. So both Guido Sterl and David Harvey and Daniel Keller, actually, to some degree. So a lot of art people have been talking about this. But the era that we're moving towards now is something like a national monopoly capitalism. And so this is quite different than the neoliberal era of the past. And I'm not sure that this is a product of internet culture. I think that this is a kind of development through law and competition, and it's playing out in the field of the internet with kind of, weird ideological factions with like emoji signifiers. But I don't think its genesis is from Twitter, for example.
No, I don't think that either. In fact, maybe I've sort of not presented my ideas well here, but I don't think that any of that stuff matters at all.
But it may have been like Twitter or Instagram or whoever may have been influencing it a lot in the years previous. Like I would say that a lot of those genres that came out were in the short term like quite impactful for ideological currents, like Ted Kaczynski memes or whatever. And what that did for, primarily on the right. But those things were impactful for a period.
And despite that, so I agree that they might have been important ideologies in the past. I guess there was a feeling that there are these deep currents in American political culture, but there are also the matter of the empire, right? There is also the matter of the global structure that the US must maintain. And I think we're going to have a very serious confrontation in some ways in the next few years, possibly when J.D. Vance becomes president, who is an ideologically driven man, whose ideas did come, to some extent, from Twitter, did come from this kind of Cambrian explosion of different ideologies, and yet who will be placed at the top of a system that he does not control, that he does not organize, and that we will sort of discover in that moment how much ideology actually matters. Right? And whether or not there simply are too many structural features of the US empire for ideology to make any effect at all. Right? And that will be in some ways the capstone of this era in which ideology seems to play this overextended part. And we will find out whether or not J.D. Vance can prevent the US from administering a global empire that has its own structural dimensions because it goes against his ideology or because he has a different ideology about how it should be run. We will find out how much ideology matters when he becomes president.
Richard, can I can I ask you a quick question about this? If we're recognizing this tendency towards the formation of like monopoly capitalism within nation states, right, as compared to the neoliberal model, which was trying to create more and more global competition. So now it's constrained to the nation state, and there's big monopoly companies like we got 5 big tech companies, whatever. Is there then an interesting role where like we could see the power, the potency of ideology with how those companies are nationalized? Does does it turn into a national health service, or does it turn into like a deranged libertarian fiat something? I don't know, but there is some kind of like a general tendency, which is like the kind of laws of competition and states and things that we can't control. And then there's going to be J.D. Vance, who has to like at some moment just kind of like tip the I don't know what the metaphor is, but like the die and try and like wave his hand over the die and try to push it in one direction or another.
Yeah, I'm not gonna. I don't think people are kind of completely absent from this picture, but I think the structures have a logic of their own. I imagine that there are different ways of doing nationalization, right? There are different ways. Certainly, there is a key question about to what extent, or if at all, you make the previous owners of that capital whole, right? Do you pay them off? Do you simply expropriate it? Do you allow them to be autonomous actors in some sense, right? We have the world's worst nationalization structure in the UK, right? Where everything's still very expensive. Classic example here is Thames Water, which was a kind of a thing nationalized a few decades ago, where we still have to pay for it and pay for all its upkeep, but all the profits go to like just a small group of investors, just like the most kind of outrageous thing. But like there is just like amazing, just like completely ridiculous. And clearly, it could have been done in a different way. Yeah. So the process of privatization had its options, right? I think nationalization will have its options as well. One of the very interesting, perhaps, ways in which we're seeing something like this happen is during the recent wave of ceasefire announcements and then retractions, announcements, retractions, which I think about the Iran war, right? Which are pretty nakedly market manipulation. right, on the part of Trump. And it's interesting that Trump is, of course, his own platform owner, right? He owns Truth Social, which is his sort of social media thing. So you get the dynamic where there is a kind of nationalization that's already happened in a sense, right? Because the president owns a social media outlet, and the way he allows that to be profitable for himself as an entity, like a distinct from being the president, is that he is now offering to sell you access to the API, so that you can get Trump's tweets milliseconds before other people get them, so you can make the trades that would allow you to manipulate or get ahead of the market, right?
So I will accept that definition if we also agree that Trump is a monarch, because then the state is his own sovereign private property. So the analogy of nationalization fits well there.
I don't think. I mean, that's obviously not legally the case, but there is a sense in which the entire armature of
it's not legally, but mimetically, it's the case.
Yeah. And it's the case at the level of a shift between two different kinds of power, right? The kind of the more institutional forms of power and the familial form of power, the ruling clan or the ruling party or the ruling individuals, right? Which Trump increasingly represents. This is a big historical shift that that comes out of Weber. Josh Citarella, thank you so much for doing your own research.
Richard, thank you. It's great to see you.